Welcome to the Tri-Cities Historical Museum virtual lecture series. My name is Karen Lowe, and I'm Highland Park Association's historian, as well as author of the book, The Historic Cottages of Highland Park. It's my honor to be your guest host for this third session in the lecture series on Highland Park. Today I'll be covering one of my favorite topics, the people and cottages of Highland Park, which I've divided into three parts. First, the road to Highland Park, where I'll give you a brief overview of the origins of the Highland Park Association. Next, we'll cover some of the early cottage owners with a focus on some of the prominent families of Grand Haven and Grand Rapids. And finally, I'll close with a section on some Highland Park legends and myths. So my own obsession, if you will, with historic Highland Park began almost 20 years ago when I first stayed in one of the quaint cottages along the ridge. Those of you who have wandered through Highland Park on the boardwalks or on the walkways know just how magical it can be, almost like a stroll back in time. And whether you're deep in the woods or high up on the sand dunes overlooking the lake, you can often hear the roar of the waves from Lake Michigan. Perhaps this was what attracted the very early visitors to Highland Park. So in the beginning, before there were cottages, there was camping or tenting. Not just for the locals, but we know that prominent Grand Rapids families also discovered the beauty of the wooded dunes along Grand Haven's lakeshore. This 1934 letter from Elizabeth Rhines McCarthy, whose family built the first cottage in Highland Park, tells us more about those early days. In the summer of 1883, my special friend Sarah Cromer was camping there with her brother, Arthur Cromer. She kindly invited me to visit her for a week. Thus I did, and it was a most thrilling experience for me, my first tent. I enjoyed it so much I began a campaign when I got home to have my parents, my stepfather, Dr. William G. Saunders, and my mother, camp on the ridge opposite. They procured a large commodious tent for us. We also interested our neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Cushing and daughter Josephine, now Mrs. Frank Coleman. They invited to be with them in another tent Mr. Adolphus Skinner and two sons, Harry and Mark. Our family stayed here for 2 years, but it seemed wiser for our family to have our own cottage. So where did these early families first camp? Let's look at the boundaries of the Highland Park Association, as there's often a lot of confusion about where it starts and ends. Pictured here is a map of Highland Park, courtesy of Bob Pescourse. I've inserted a little blue outline of where the old Highland Park Hotel used to be, and I've also identified where the Saunders family tent was, as well as where the Cromers tented. So Arthur Cromer would become the only original incorporator of the Highland Park Association that was not from the Tri-Cities area. So as you look at this map, Highland Park Association is bounded on the north by Lake Avenue and on the south by Stickney Ridge, which is well past or further south of today's Grand Avenue. Now, on the left here, notice this small section of property that lies north of Lake Avenue. A Grand Rapids gentleman by the name of Adolphus Skinner secured his own lease with the city of Grand Haven for a piece of land he called the Highland Park Camping Club. This is important because Skinner's lease was made in 1885, a full year before the Highland Park Association was organized, and the term of his lease was for 99 years. It wasn't until May of 1886, the following year, that the Highland Park Association and its original shareholders, who were almost entirely from Grand Haven, struck a deal with the city of Grand Haven to lease their association's land for a term of 30 years, not 99. So essentially, Mr. Skinner from Grand Rapids got a much better deal than those local Grand Haven men. To the south, we have Stickney Ridge, the Stickney Ridge Association, which is also called, I think officially, the Central Highland Park Association. Stickney Ridge was established about 15 to 20 years after the Highland Park Association. Willard Stickney, son of the original landowners Leonard and Charlotte Stickney, built many of the original cottages beginning around 1899, 1900, along with the car barn and some other facilities that I think no longer stand. Unlike Highland Park, though, the land was not owned by the city of Grand Haven and leased then to Highland Park and Highland Park cottage owners, but it was owned rather by the Stickney family. So as a result, the cottage owners in Stickney Ridge purchased their lots, as I understand it, versus leasing the lots from the city. So to add to the naming confusion, when newspapers around the turn of the century referred to a cottage in Highland Park, it could mean that the cottage was on the Highland Park Camping Club grounds, it could mean in the Highland Park Association, or it could mean Stickney Ridge, or really, for that matter, anywhere along the lakeshore. But interestingly enough, it turns out that this Adolphus Skinner of Grand Rapids, due to staking his very early claim, was really responsible for the overall name, the Highland Park Association, along with its hotel and resort of cottages, even though he was technically never a part of it. So how and when did it all begin? Well, by 1870, both Spring Lake and Grand Haven had discovered, and Fruitport for that matter, had discovered mineral springs. And the Tri-Cities area became this popular destination for wealthy families from all over the Midwest to come and, quote unquote, take the waters. At the same time, the lumber industry, which had fueled growth for Grand Haven and Spring Lake, began to decline. So a number of prominent Grand Haven men, several of them lumbermen themselves, recognized the need to further develop other industries, and they saw an opportunity to create a resort community with a grand hotel on the shores of Lake Michigan. So in 1886, the Highland Park Association was legally incorporated with its purpose to maintain a park and pleasure resort. And according to the Articles of Incorporation, the association raised $5,000 through the sale of 200 shares at $25 a share to 51 original investors. On May 10th of that same year, 1886, the city of Grand Haven leased 68 acres of that land to the newly found Highland Park Association. Now, there were less than 10 cottages when the Highland Park Hotel held its grand opening, which was on July 4th, 1889. But then by 1896, almost half of the 100 cottages were built. So that's just 10 years after the incorporation. It would end up taking almost 20 more years before the remaining 50 cottages were built. Now, in 1900, over 14,000 feet of new boardwalk was laid by the association, which gives you an indication of the kind of ongoing investment that was required for the Highland Park Association. One little known fact, even by members of the Highland Park Association, was that the high boardwalk on Poplar Ridge overlooking Lake Michigan used to extend from the Breezy Rest Cottage at 66 Poplar Ridge all the way down to 107 Poplar Ridge near Grand Avenue. Sadly, half of the boardwalk became dilapidated during World War II due to the city of Grand Haven's refusal to renew the lease with the Highland Park Association, which had apparently run out just prior to the war. Fortunately, in 1952, the association and the city came to an agreement where cottage owners purchased the property that their cottages were on from the city. However, it was too late, sadly, for this section of boardwalk, which I've highlighted in red on this map, which was closed off then at 93 Poplar Ridge on the north side and 104 Poplar Ridge on the south. Another interesting thing here, wooden plank sidewalks, which were laid all along the sand where Harbor Avenue is now, were actually the things that were called boardwalks. What we call boardwalks today, the high boardwalks, were actually referred to as bridges. So the boardwalk along Lake Michigan, illustrated here, used to be called the Bridge of Sighs, presumably because of the stunning views. One other thing I'd like to point out on this old map from 1900 is the names of the last few stops on the dummy line. After the Highland Park stop, which is where Noto's at the Bill Maher is located, there was a Lakeview stop, which, as you can see here, is the beach level in front of 93 Poplar Ridge. Then the viewpoint stop, which is right in front of about 105 or 106 Poplar Ridge. And then finally Stickney Ridge, which was the stop at the loop where the dummy would turn around. So let's move on to the cottages themselves and the early owners. I'll spend most of our time today talking about the families from Grand Haven and Grand Rapids, but I will touch on a few from Chicago and St. Louis as well. Built around 1887, the first owner of Grey Gables Cottage, which is at 25 Crescent Hill, was Dwight Cutler. As mentioned earlier, there were 51 original incorporators of Highland Park, but none had more shares than Dwight Cutler. Of the 200 shares, Cutler and his son, Dwight Jr., had 10% or 20 shares between the two of them. Perhaps this was why on a plat map from 1900, there's a large area called Cutler's Reserve, which I've identified on this map by a green circle. Dwight Cutler was born in Massachusetts and came to Grand Haven in about 1847. In 1870, he went into business with a gentleman by the name of Hunter Savage, and just 4 years later, their company, the Cutler and Savage Lumber Company, had amassed some $500,000 in capital and was already the largest lumber company in western Michigan. But that's not all. For 20 years, Dwight Cutler was president of the First National Bank of Grand Haven, a bank that he helped organize. Cutler was also elected mayor of Grand Haven 4 times between 1869 and 1891. But some might say that his crowning glory, so to speak, was the beautiful, majestic 5-story Cutler House Hotel on Main Street or on Washington Street in Grand Haven, which was built in 1872. It was the equivalent of a 5-star luxury hotel today. One of the exciting discoveries in researching Highland Park was this lease from 1896 I found, which says it's from the grantor Highland Park Association to the grantee Dwight Cutler for land identified as Cutler's Reserve, but as occupied by Messrs. Cutler, Sheldon, and Savage, meaning all 3 gentlemen had cottages on the leased land. But why, you might ask, would Dwight Cutler lease all this land and then allow 2 other wealthy businessmen in their own right, Savage and Sheldon, to build cottages on his land? It's a good question. Well, let's first take a look at W.C. Sheldon, who built the Wickiup Cottage next door to Cutler. In addition to building the beautiful Queen Anne home that's pictured here and located at 321 Washington in Grand Haven, Willard Carpenter Sheldon was president of the Challenge Corn Planter and Refrigerator Works. He was also founder of Sheldon's Magnetic Miracle Springs Resort and Spa in Grand Haven. So, a pretty accomplished individual. Are you still puzzled? I was too, until I found this. Hamilton may have had the Schuyler sisters, but Grand Haven had the Slayton sisters. Yes, turns out that Cutler and Sheldon married sisters. Dwight Cutler married Frances Slayton, and Sheldon married Mary Malvinia Slayton. And just a little bit of trivia. Nathaniel V. Slayton, brother to Frances and Mary, was also one of the original 50 incorporators of Highland Park. Next to Dwight Cutler and his son, Nathaniel Slayton had 6 shares, more than any of the other remaining incorporators. On the other side, to the east of the Cutler Cottage, was Whispering Pines Cottage at 24 Crescent Hill. William Savage built this cottage, presumably for his widowed mother, Sarah Savage, since William Savage himself never married. William was the eldest son of Hunter Savage, Dwight Cutler's business partner. He was a graduate of University of Michigan and Harvard Law School. And in 1881, when his father passed away, as the eldest son, William took charge of the Savage family interests. And as accomplished as he was, William Savage is probably best remembered today as one of the founders of both the Spring Lake Yacht Club and the Spring Lake Country Club. So essentially, Dwight Cutler had his brother-in-law, Sheldon, as well as his business partner, Savage, also build cottages on the land that he leased. Following Cutler's lead, other Grand Haven men quickly staked their claim to some pretty sweet lots in Highland Park. For instance, there was George McBride, who built Cozy Corner at 59 Poplar Ridge. George McBride was a decorated Civil War veteran, and after the war, he opened up a law office with Healy Akeley, coincidentally in the building now occupied by the Tri-Cities Historical Museum. McBride served as president of the Highland Park Association for 5 years, and along with his wife Martha, managed the Highland Park Hotel from 1899 to 1908. There was also Joseph Keltz, mayor of Grand Haven in 1895, and a successful cigar manufacturer and shop owner in Grand Haven. Joseph Keltz had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Florence. He named his best-selling cigar Little Bessie after his eldest daughter, and his cottage Castle Florence after his youngest. Keltz was one of Highland Park Association's longest-serving presidents, a position that he held from 1895 until 1903. And then there was master ship carpenter John Neal, who built Blarney Castle, the cottage at 57 Poplar Ridge, now known as Anthony House. Along with Thomas Kirby and John Callister, John Neal established Mechanics Dry Dock and Shipyard in Grand Haven, which built many of the great steamers that were manufactured here locally. There were other Grand Haven men who chose some premium lots facing Lake Michigan. Pictured here are 2 pre-1900 photos, courtesy of the museum, that show a few of the Poplar Ridge cottages. In other words, overlooking harbor just south of Notos. There was lumber baron Charles Boyden. Yes, it's the same Charles Boyden whose in-town home is now the Boyden House B&B at 5th and Lafayette in Grand Haven. Boyden's company, Boyden and Akeley's Shingle and Sawmill, became the world's largest shingle mill and produced the best-known and most popular shingle of that time. Charles and his wife Jerusha built the Kilcare Cottage at 60 Poplar Ridge. And then there was Captain Samuel Glover of White and Glover Lumber Mill, who built the Breakers Cottage next door, now called the Corbeth. Some of you may recall that it was Samuel Glover who in 1891 deeded to the city of Grand Haven a large parcel of land which became the north end of Lake Forest Cemetery. Finally, there were the McPhees, also lumbermen, John McPhee and son Robert Graham McPhee. The McPhees leased 3 lots on the highest point of the dune and ultimately built 3 cottages, Bonnie Doon, Tangletop, and Bowsite at 67, 68, and 89 Poplar Ridge. Note that Tangletop Cottage, which is in the middle of the 3, was the cottage of Robert Graham McPhee and his wife, Maud Boyden, who was, as you probably guessed, the daughter of Charles and Jerusha Boyden. All of these Grand Haven men chose lots on the ridge known appropriately back then as Lakeview. All in all, more than a dozen Grand Haven men and at least 5 of the original incorporators built cottages in Highland Park between 1887 and 1891. So let's shift gears and talk about some of the early owners from Grand Rapids. Prominent families from what was considered the big city quickly found their way to Highland Park as well. For example, on the north side of Highland Park, there was the Saunders family. And if there was any family that was royalty in Highland Park, other than the Otleys maybe, it would have to be the Saunders family, as they built 4 of the original cottages in Highland Park. In 1887, Sarah Benedict Saunders and her husband, Dr. William Saunders, built the very first cottage in the park, which they named Loch Haim, meaning lake home in Scottish. A few years later, they built a second cottage next door to the west at 1408 Lake Avenue. And then, not long thereafter, Abigail Saunders, the widow of William's brother Burton Saunders, built Here We Are Cottage, now called Escarbin, which is at 31 Honeymoon Hill. Burton Saunders was the owner and proprietor of the Sherman House Hotel in Grand Rapids. And finally, Abigail's daughter, Velma Finette Saunders McCormick, and her husband Fred built a cottage next door to her mother's, which she called Camp Forest. By the way, these lovely family photos you see here are courtesy of Sue Fuller, who is a descendant of Abigail and Burton Saunders. In addition to the Saunders family, there were other notable early owners from Grand Rapids. For instance, there was the widow of Joseph Putnam, one of the three brothers and founders of the Putnam Candy Company of Grand Rapids. Putnam built Glen Erie Cottage at 70 Beechwood Lane. Then there was Grand Rapids architect David S. Hopkins, who designed and built the imposing Highland Castle at 27 Crescent Hill. David Hopkins was both an architect as well as an entrepreneur who, in the late 1800s, actually originated the mail order system of selling residential architectural plans to homeowners in both the U.S. and Canada. Hopkins enjoyed considerable success both locally here in Michigan and nationally. In addition to designing Highland Castle here in Highland Park, I wanted to point out that David Hopkins was the architect of the Hackley Hume Mansions nearby here in Muskegon, Michigan. Finally, there was Oliver Waters, president of the Michigan Barrel Company, who built two cottages in Highland Park, Grand Lodge and Lively Lodge. Oliver Waters was the brother of Daniel Waters, one of the most successful and wealthiest lumbermen and businessmen in Michigan. In fact, it was through Daniel Waters' estate that the 6-story Waters Building in Grand Rapids was created in 1899, which at the time was the largest building in the world dedicated to furniture exposition, and as a result probably contributed to Grand Rapids being known as Furniture City. On what we call the south end of Highland Park, which is past today's Grand Avenue, there was William Fox, president of the Fox Typewriter Company of Grand Rapids, who owned Sunset Lodge, which is at 118 Poplar Trail. There was also suffragist Grace Ames Van Hosen, who owned Beechwood Cottage at 117 Poplar Trail. In 1918, Grace Van Hosen was president of the Grand Rapids Equal Franchise Club, which, as some of you may know, played a vital role in the successful campaign for women's right to vote here in Michigan. Years later, Van Hosen would go on to both run for and win a seat on the Kent County Commissioners Board, where she served for 8 years. Note that no other woman was elected to the Kent County Commissioners Board until 1976. Finally, there was Shippahoy Cottage at 112 Poplar Trail. William Würzburg, president of Würzburg Department Stores, expanded the small cottage on the site and built a 6-bedroom, 3-story cottage in 1899, complete with Tiffany lamps and a 3rd-floor ballroom. By 1914, Richard Chatelain, Michigan's so-called Rockefeller of Utilities, purchased the cottage, where he and his wife continued to summer every year until his death in 1967. Between 1899 and 1920, many more prominent Grand Rapids families became owners of cottages in Highland Park. In fact, by 1910, Grand Rapids men had taken over Highland Park's board of directors, which up until that point had been governed largely by Grand Haven men. I guess you could say it was a power struggle in paradise, but that's a story for another day. So what about the cottage owners from across the pond? Well, by the early 1900s, the ridge along the lakefront became known as Chicago Ridge, if that's any indication. And whether or not they were actually from Chicago, or rather Joliet, Illinois, most of them traveled by way of the Goodrich steamer from Chicago to Grand Haven. The earliest owner from Chicago was Max Hamburger, who was president of the Hamburger Company, distillers of whiskey and bourbon in Chicago. Now, Max Hamburger was important as he was the first Jewish member of the Highland Park Association Board, serving from 1895 until 1899, the year he passed away. Max and Nettie Hamburger built the Fleur de Lis cottage at 111 Poplar Ridge, now renamed Que Sera, as well as another one next door. There was Samuel Otley, Chicago cement king and patriarch of the Otley clan, who purchased Samuel Glover's cottage around 1900, and whose sons, Ben Otley and Walter Otley, would go on to purchase their own cottages in the Highland Park Association. Now, although Samuel's son, Thomas Otley, would famously spearhead the Highland Park Tennis Club efforts, Thomas Otley would end up building his family cottages not in the Highland Park Association grounds, but rather just north of Lake Avenue on the land previously known as the Highland Park Camping Club grounds, which we talked about earlier. Then there was what I call the Joliet elite, such as Belle Phelps. Belle was the daughter and heiress of Dr. George Lumbermen, one of the very first physicians in Indiana and a leading pioneer and major landowner of Logansport, Indiana. It is believed that Belle used some of her inheritance to build Hillside Cottage at 91 Poplar Ridge around 1892 and 1893. Belle was married to Captain Egbert Phelps, Civil War veteran and partner in the law firm of Owens and Phelps in Joliet. Note that Egbert's brother, Edward Phelps, was the U.S. Minister to Great Britain under the Cleveland administration, and in 1878, he was one of the founders of the American Bar Association. Other Joliet elite included Thomas Hotchkiss, general manager of the Phoenix Horse and Shoe Company, who married Phelps's daughter, Margaret, and purchased the cottage next door in 1899. There was Fred Wilcox, owner of Wilcox and Brothers Carriage and Lumber Company, who built Point View Cottage in 1895, and Harless King, president of the King Coal Company of Joliet. But the most famous and interesting of the Chicago cottage owners had to be humanitarian Ernest P. Bicknell, who, with his wife Grace, built two cottages in Highland Park at 97 and 98 Poplar Ridge, Windy Howe and Tip Top. Prior to 1906, Ernest Bicknell was the general superintendent of the Chicago Bureau of Charities, and during that time, he was put in charge of distributing Red Cross funds in the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Well, he must have done a very good job because by 1908, he was named National Director of the Red Cross, a position created specifically for him. When World War I broke out, Bicknell was named Deputy Commissioner to France and served as a member of several international relief organizations, among many other roles. In the end, his humanitarian efforts earned Bicknell the highest humanitarian honors from Belgium, France, Italy, Russia, Greece, Montenegro, Poland, and Serbia. A truly amazing individual. And finally, St. Louis. One widely held misperception is that a significant number of early cottage owners were from St. Louis. It's certainly what I thought when I began my research. Well, it is true that many St. Louis families summered in Highland Park. Only a handful actually built or owned cottages, which makes sense when you consider the following. First of all, Grand Haven's Cutler House Hotel and Sheldon's Magnetic Miracle Springs were frequented by St. Louis families long before Highland Park was established. In fact, in David Dyer Hunting's memoir, Summers in the Haven, he writes that his family from St. Louis, the Dyers, stayed for years at the Cutler House or the Spring Lake House. He says of both the Dyer and the Hunting families, "We never owned a cottage. For 60 years, we rented in Highland Park." Second of all, the Highland Park Hotel guest registers from the 1890s and the early 1900s indicate a large number of guests from St. Louis who booked for the entire summer. In fact, newspaper articles from the 1890s frequently refer to the many St. Louis guests staying at the Highland Park Hotel or in renting cottages. Finally, some of you, like me, have been told that Crescent Ridge in Highland Park used to be referred to as St. Louis Ridge due to all the owners from St. Louis, which it actually isn't true. St. Louis Ridge was actually Edward Street, located north of Lake Avenue, so not within Highland Park Association boundaries at all. And how do we know this? We know this from the 1934 letters from Elizabeth Rhines McCarthy, whose family owned the very first cottage. So, while it's true that St. Louisans dominated Highland Park in the early years, they were a minority when it came to owning cottages or as voting members of the Highland Park Association. So in this last section, I thought it would be fun to close with 3 legends and myths of Highland Park. Let's see if we have any budding history detectives or mythbusters out there. According to Highland Park legend, before she became famous, Norma Shearer stayed in Highland Park with her aunt and uncle, who owned the cottage on lot number 20, now called Nantucket Knot. For you youngsters out there, Norma Shearer was considered the first lady of MGM and a major Hollywood star from 1925 through 1942. In fact, she was nominated 6 times for an Academy Award for Best Actress and won once for her performance in the 1930 film The Divorcee. Norma Shearer married Irving Thalberg, successful Hollywood producer and MGM's boy wonder. So, the cottage on lot number 20 was built, indeed, in 1907 or sometime between 1907 and 1914 by Edwin and Gertrude Percival. The Percivals named their cottage the Baldpate Inn after the book and stage play 7 Keys to Baldpate, which apparently Gertrude, a stage actress, had starred in at some point. Now, in initially researching this, I was a little stumped as I could not find an aunt or uncle with the last name Percival related to actress Norma Shearer. That is until I looked closely and followed the maternal uncle of Norma Shearer, Edwin P. Fisher. It turns out that our Edwin Percival of Highland Park was born Edwin Percival Fisher in Canada. As former Canadian film exhibitor and theatrical manager, he changed his name, dropping his surname of Fisher before immigrating to the U.S. in the early 1900s. In 1904, Edwin Percival married Gertrude Ritchie Bevel, and the newlyweds summered in Grand Haven for several years before Edwin Percival moved to Grand Haven to accept a job with the Grand Trunk Railway around 1907. So on this, we say yes, Norma Shearer likely did stay in Highland Park with her maternal uncle, Edwin Percival. Our second legend. The Highland Park tennis courts once hosted the U.S. Junior National Tennis Tournament in the 1930s. Pictured here are 2 photos. On the left is the 1914 photo of a single concrete tennis court in Highland Park, courtesy of Jane Hotchkiss. On the right is a 1931 photo, courtesy of Trudy Beck, from the doubles finals of the Highland Park Tennis Classic, also known as the Otley Cup, after the 2 courts were created. So in 1920, Thomas Otley and Eldred Bentley organized the Highland Park Tennis Club in order to build tournament-worthy courts, and in 1927, the club hosted its first tournament. Although unfortunately it never hosted the U.S. Junior Nationals, by 1931 the Highland Park Tennis Classic was considered one of the top 3 junior tournaments in the country. According to local historian Wally Ewing, the Highland Park Tennis Tournament reached its peak in the mid to late 1930s, attracting over half of the top 20 juniors nationwide, including at least 3 future U.S. Davis Cup team players: Gene Mako, Don Budge, Hal Surface, along with tennis icon Bobby Riggs. In fact, here is another rare photo of Gene Mako on our courts. He's standing on the left. Mako was the singles champion of the 1931 Highland Park Tennis Classic. Gene Mako would go on to become a future International Tennis Hall of Famer and a 4-time Grand Slam doubles winner. Our third and final legend. John F. Kennedy was in Highland Park long before he became the 35th President of the United States. So here is the backstory, taken from a 2003 interview of Eleanor Beaton, then age 91, and conducted by the late Gail Brink. And I've paraphrased this. A summer resident of Highland Park for her entire life, the late Eleanor Beaton relayed an interesting brush with fame from many years ago. Mrs. Beaton was carrying several grocery bags up the many steps to her cottage. She spotted a young man who was coming back from the beach with friends, and as they cut through the cottages of Highland Park, Eleanor Beaton asked for some help toting sacks of groceries up the boardwalk stairs. The handsome young man graciously agreed and refused the tip that Eleanor offered. It wasn't until years later that she realized who the amiable young man was, John F. Kennedy. According to Mrs. Beaton, JFK was likely visiting the Hatton family of Grand Haven, Lydia in particular. It's important to note that Mrs. Beaton could not provide the interviewer with a date or a time frame of when this happened. So, what are the facts? Well, this one's tough. There was no clear, direct connection of JFK with any member of the Hatton family. President John F. Kennedy wasn't the right age to be a close contemporary of either Julian Hatton I, who was about 20 years older than JFK, or his son, Julian Hatton II, who was 10 years younger than JFK, or any other immediate family members, for that matter. And the only Lydia Hatton from Grand Haven was the daughter of Julian Hatton II, who was the age of JFK's son, John F. Kennedy Jr. There is evidence that JFK Jr. and Lydia Hatton dated while attending Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts together, and that he, JFK Jr., may have visited the Tri-Cities area during the 1970s. A couple of other considerations. If it was JFK, the encounter would have had to happen prior to his graduation from Harvard in 1940. And here's why. Immediately post-graduation, JFK joined the U.S. Naval Reserve and commanded a series of PT boats during World War II. Some of you may recall PT-109. Then, after the war, JFK represented the 11th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1947 until 1953. So, if you put that all together, in 1940, JFK was 23 years old, and Eleanor was just 5 years older, about 28 years old. So, while it's not impossible, it seems unlikely that JFK was the nice young man who Mrs. Beaton referred to in terms of helping her. So, what does it mean? Was Mrs. Beaton mistaken? Not necessarily, but it is possible she may have had the wrong Kennedy brother. It turns out that there was indeed a member of the Kennedy family who had close connections to the Hattons of Grand Haven in the 1940s. Julian Hatton II was a classmate of Bobby Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, who would become the 64th United States Attorney General. Bobby Kennedy enlisted in the Navy in 1943 and was selected for the Navy College Officer Training Program at Harvard. After World War II, he returned to Harvard to complete his junior and senior years, graduating with Julian Hatton II in what was called the War Class of 1948. So, as college classmates, it's entirely possible that between 1946 and 1948, that Bobby Kennedy spent some time with the Hatton family in Grand Haven, Michigan. Bobby Kennedy would have been between 21 and 23 years old, while JFK would have been about 30, 31. Eleanor Beaton would have been about 35 years old, married and with young children. So, given the close family resemblance, Bobby Kennedy and JFK, it is both possible and certainly understandable that Mrs. Beaton may have mistaken Robert F. Kennedy for John F. Kennedy. Both brothers, remember, would have had that unmistakable Boston accent. So, what's the verdict? History detective believes the polite young man who helped Eleanor Beaton was indeed a Kennedy from Boston. So, if you guessed true, false, and definitely plausible, then, like me, you just might be an amateur history detective. Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed exploring Highland Park. Don't forget to check out the museum exhibit, and if you are interested in learning more about the people and cottages of Highland Park, the first volume of my book is available at the museum store or online at lulu.com. Thank you again for joining us today. This is Karen Lowe, signing off. Until next time.